Mid-14th century Europe, a time when you could go to bed strong and healthy and wake up dying. It started with a fever that struck without mercy. Then came the dark, agonizing swellings beneath the arms and neck, the buboes. Within days, sometimes mere hours, entire family trees were severed. Church bells rang so incessantly to announce the dead that cities eventually forbade them for fear they would drive the living to madness. Graveyards burst at the seams. Streets fell into a terrifying silence. Across the continent, a single question haunted the minds of everyone from kings to peasants. Is this the end of the world? They didn't know it then, but they were living through the single deadliest event in recorded human history. A catastrophe that would wipe out half of Europe and permanently rewrite the DNA of civilization. This was the Black Death, and once the clock started ticking, there was no escape. To truly grasp the horror of the fall, we must first understand the height of the cliff. The early 1300s weren't the Dark Ages of popular myth, it was the zenith of the High Middle Ages, a golden era of stability and explosive growth. Thanks to the medieval warm period, harvests had been bountiful for generations. The population had doubled. Cities were spilling over their ancient Roman walls, bursting with life. Paris, Florence, Venice, London, these were vibrant, chaotic hives of humanity. Gothic cathedrals clawed their way toward the heavens, symbols of a society that felt invincible, technologically advanced, and close to God. But the true marvel was their connection. This was the medieval World Wide Web. A merchant in Venice could purchase silk that had traversed the entire breadth of Asia, secured by the Pax Mongolica. This vast, interconnected network moved gold, spices, and ideas faster than ever before. It was a glorious, optimistic world. But this very connection was a trap. The same trade routes that brought unimaginable wealth were paving a highway for the greatest killer mankind would ever face. The infrastructure for the apocalypse was perfectly laid. A society at its peak was about to be ambushed by an enemy it couldn't see, couldn't understand, and absolutely could not fight. The fuse was lit thousands of miles away from the cobblestones of Europe, in the windswept steppes of Central Asia. Here, in a landscape of harsh extremes, an ancient killer had slept for millennia. Yersinia pestis, a ruthless bacterium living in the blood of marmots and ground squirrels. For centuries, it stayed in ecological balance. But in the 1330s, nature turned against humanity. Climate change, droughts followed by floods, destroyed the food sources of these rodents, driving them and their fleas toward human settlements. The pivot point of history occurred in 1346 at the glittering city of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula. A vital trade hub, Kaffa was under siege by the Golden Horde. But the Mongol army wasn't just fighting the Genoese defenders, they were fighting a silent killer within their own ranks. Soldiers were dropping dead by the thousands, their bodies blackened by gangrene. Facing defeat, the Mongol commander, Yani Beg, made a decision that would doom a continent. In a horrific act of biological warfare, he ordered the pestilent corpses of his own men loaded onto trebuchets. For days, it rained death over the walls of Kaffa. The Genoese watched in horror as bodies smashed into their streets. The bacteria, hitching a ride on fluids and fleas, infiltrated the city. Panic ensued. The wealthy merchants did what they did best. They fled. 12 galleys laden with refugees and gold slipped out of the harbor. They thought they were escaping. In reality, they were the carriers. These ships sailed past Constantinople and into the heart of the Mediterranean, the economic engine of Europe. The first domino to fall was Messina, Sicily. When the locals rowed out to greet the arriving ships, they found a floating graveyard. The sailors were dead or delirious, covered in black boils, oozing blood and pus. Messina tried to expel the ships, but it was too late. The rats and the fleas had already scurried down the mooring ropes. From that moment, the spread was mathematical and merciless. The close quarters of medieval ports acted like an accelerant. Messina collapsed within weeks. The infection jumped to Marseille, then Genoa, then Venice. The Venetians, masters of trade, tried to fight back. They invented the quarantine, 40 days of isolation. It was a brilliant idea, but for the first wave, it was like trying to hold back a tsunami with a wooden shield. The canals of Venice became open graves. Gondolas, once symbols of romance and commerce, became hearses piled high with corpses. From the coasts, the invisible army marched inland, following river barges and trade roads into the dense heart of Europe. When the plague hit a metropolis like Paris or London, it didn't just kill people, it killed the city itself. The intricate machinery of medieval society shattered. Doctors from the University of Paris, the brightest minds of their time, were helpless. They blamed the alignment of planets. They blamed miasma or bad air. Their cures were worse than the disease, bleeding patients who were already weak or piercing the buboes, which only sprayed infection further. The psychological toll was shattering. Giovanni Boccaccio, witnessing the destruction of Florence, wrote of a world where the social contract had evaporated. Mothers abandoned sick children. Husbands left wives to die alone. The fear of contagion was stronger than love, stronger than duty. The dead accumulated so fast they couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. They were stacked in massive plague pits, layer upon layer, like firewood. To the medieval mind, this could only be one thing: divine punishment. God was angry. People flocked to churches, praying for salvation, only to infect each other in the crowded naves. When prayer failed, radicalism took over. The flagellants, bands of men in hooded robes, marched through towns, whipping themselves with iron-tipped scourges until blood ran down their backs, hoping to take the sins of the world upon their flesh. Darker still was the search for a scapegoat. If God wasn't listening, surely the devil was at work. A hideous conspiracy theory took root, that Jewish communities were poisoning the wells. Despite the Pope himself condemning these lies, mob mentality reigned. In cities like Strasbourg and Cologne, entire communities were rounded up and burned alive. The Black Death brought out the best in a few, but the absolute worst in many. It wasn't just the cities. The plague crept into the silent countryside, where 90% of the population lived. Entire villages were wiped off the map, leaving only ghost towns. Crops rotted in the fields. Sheep and cattle wandered aimlessly, turning feral because there were no shepherds left to tend them. The wilderness began to reclaim the land. By 1350, the shadow had touched the frozen north of Scandinavia, even extinguishing the Norse colonies in Greenland. By 1351, the fire began to burn itself out. The toll was unfathomable, perhaps 200 million dead across Eurasia. But as the smoke cleared, the survivors looked around at a changed world. The immediate aftermath was chaos, but then something remarkable happened. With half the workforce gone, the value of a human being skyrocketed. For the first time, peasants could demand better wages. The rigid chains of feudalism cracked. The Black Death, in its cruel efficiency, birthed the golden age of the laborer. It shattered the blind faith of the Middle Ages and forced humanity to question, to adapt, to look for answers beyond the heavens. The Black Death was the greatest trauma the West ever endured. It destroyed a world, yes, but it cleared the ground for the modern one to rise. For centuries, we treated this as ancient history. But looking at the empty streets and the fear of the invisible that we have seen in our own times, it doesn't feel so distant, does it? The plague was a test, and history has a funny way of giving retakes. We look back so we can see forward. Join me next time as we turn the page to another era.